Thank you for joining us on this session where we're going to look at the interplay between the different types of statutory advocacy. So just to recap, there are 6 types of advocacy that have been introduced in legislation. And the way it's evolved over the last 20 years has meant that it's been very piecemeal. So what we've had is different bits of legislation that deal with different sections of health and social care. And in those bits of legislation, they basically make it a duty on the local authority or NHS to pay and arrange for an independent advocate to be available for people in certain situations. So the 6 types of statutory advocacy include children's advocacy, which came in 2002 as part of the Children Act, or amendment to the Children Act, I should say. Then in 2005, in the Mental Capacity Act, we had IMCA. A couple of years later, we had IMHA. Then we had NHS complaints advocacy. Then we had DOLS, which extended IMCA to adults going through deprivation of liberty safeguard processes. And then most recently, in the 2014 Acts, we've had Care Act advocacy in England, and in Wales, independent professional advocacy. So what we're going to do now is just have a little look at when those different bits of legislation cross over and see what happens when somebody's entitled to more than one advocate. And a big spoiler alert, what we're saying is that where somebody is entitled to more than one advocate, it's really, really important that they get the same advocate that simply take on the different roles. So get trained in the different roles, the different bits of legislation. So let's start with that. Let's start with the crossover between IMHA and IMCA. So the big one is if you are held in a mental health hospital, if you're detained under the Mental Health Act, you are automatically going to be entitled to an IMHA. Now, as you know, the Mental Health Act won't authorise or deal with any decisions to do with physical health. But lots of people who are detained under the Mental Health Act will still experience physical health conditions and impairments and may need treatment or assessments for those difficulties. Now, if the person lacks capacity to make those decisions and make choices about, say, tests or treatment, and they don't have anybody who can act as their consultee, then an IMCA will need to be instructed. So what you might have is, let's say, somebody in hospital receiving treatment for a mental health condition, which an IMHA will help them with, but then they start to get, problems with the digestion and they need to have some tests, they might need an endoscopy, then an IMCA would then be instructed to help them and represent them as that decision is made about what treatment they could have. Now, it could be 2 separate people, of course. It could be an IMHA and a separate IMCA, but it makes a lot more sense for that person to be the same person, mostly because they're going to know them and the person will know the advocate, and things like communication will make it better. The other crossover between IMHA and IMCA is when somebody's leaving hospital. So if the local authority or NHS are going to be responsible for arranging accommodation once the person is discharged from their section, and this could be under section 117 aftercare, or it might not be, then if they hit the other criteria for IMCA, then an IMCA should be instructed on the specific decision about change of accommodation. Now, of course, when that decision is made will be when the person is still detained in hospital. Because on the point of discharge, of course, they're not just going to be discharged and not have anywhere to live. So the decision on where to live will be whilst they're in hospital. So at that point, they would have an IMHA for the mental health care and treatment issues and decisions, and then an IMCA to help them with the decision on where they should live. And again, it makes sense for that advocate to be the same advocate. Let's have a little look at crossover between IMHA and Care Act. So we just mentioned there around somebody leaving hospital. If the person is going to have adult, care and support needs in the community, and again, that might be through section 117, if they face substantial difficulty at making choices and decisions around that, what that care plan and support could look like, then a Care Act advocate should be offered. And similar to the IMCA, the Care Act advocates should be working with them whilst they're in hospital before they're discharged and before they start to receive the 117 aftercare. So for somebody who lacks capacity, who's been detained under the Mental Health Act, they could have an IMHA for their care and treatment for the mental health issues. They could have an IMCA to represent and support them through the change of accommodation. And they should then have a Care Act advocate to help them with the broader care and support planning once they're in the community. And of course, it makes sense for all three of those advocates to be the same person because of the relationship you already have with that individual, and because of the rapport you'll have, it'll be easier to offer that ongoing support. The other crossover in mental health hospitals between IMHA and Care Act is when the person who is detained under the Mental Health Act is subject to a safeguarding inquiry. So usually that would trigger Care Act advocacy to help the person to understand what's happening and to support them through it. But because they're in a mental health setting, obviously there'd be lots of IMHAs already there. And it's entirely sensible, I think, for the IMHA to then take on that role of the Care Act advocate, again, because they know the setting and because they know the person well. Let's have a little look at IMCA and Care Act and where that crosses over. And the main one is actually when somebody has an IMCA for a change of accommodation decision. So if somebody's being assessed as lacking capacity to make decisions about where they live, it's likely that they're going to face substantial difficulty at making broader care and support planning decisions as well. So we're not going to make that assumption, but I think it's likely. And if that's the case, then everyone who has an IMCA for change of accommodation decisions is going to have a Care Act advocate for the broader care and support plan. And what the Care Act guidance says is that if you qualify for IMCA and change of accommodation or the review of that accommodation move, then nearly always you'll qualify for a Care Act advocate as well. So that's worth bearing in mind, because the other way is true. If you're a Care Act advocate working and supporting somebody through broad care and support planning decisions, and they lack capacity to make decisions about where they live, and there's a decision about where they should live, then you need to be mindful to refer to IMCA on that single decision of accommodation. The other big crossover between IMCA and Care Act is that in safeguarding, and just to kind of mop up a few myths around which type of advocates should get involved in safeguarding, it's actually quite straightforward. So when the Mental Capacity Act came out, and remember, we're going back 15 years ago, the rights to have an IMCA under the Mental Capacity Act, the language that's used is it's a power to instruct an IMCA in safeguarding processes. And what that means is that if the local authority believes that it's helpful for that individual, if it's in their best interest to have an IMCA, then they can. But because it's a power, not a duty, it means that they don't have to have one. Whereas it's a duty in serious medical treatment decisions, it's a duty in long-term change of accommodations, i.e. they have to if they hit the criteria. In safeguarding, it's what we call a discretionary power. So only if the local authority think that it's useful and beneficial. The other thing with IMCA and safeguarding is there was no agreed definitive point where an IMCA should get instructed. So often you might get an IMCA at the beginning of the safeguarding inquiry, but you might get an IMCA halfway through when the inquiry is getting well established and there might be a best interest meeting. Or you might get an IMCA instructed after the best interest meeting when protective measures have been identified, and the IMCA might be asked to help work out how the person feels about the protective measures. But the point here is that there was no definitive, it was a very discretionary, at what point an IMCA gets instructed. Care Act advocacy, it's much more straightforward. So the first thing is it's a duty. So if the person's eligible, i.e. they face substantial difficulty at being involved in the process of safeguarding and they don't have anyone available to support them through it, then they have to be offered an advocate. So if you are eligible for IMCA through safeguarding, you're going to be eligible for a Care Act advocate. And then the second thing is that Care Act advocacy happens right at the beginning. So as soon as a safeguarding inquiry is triggered, the question has to be asked, does this person, are they entitled to an advocate? And if they are entitled to an advocate, do they want one? The question then is, if you have to offer Care Act advocacy right at the beginning, why on earth would you offer an IMCA? It doesn't make any sense. So it's not that the Care Act has replaced the Mental Capacity Act, it hasn't. It's just that the duties for Care Act advocacy are much stronger and they happen much earlier than IMCA. So it makes the need for an IMCA a bit redundant. Let's have a quick look now at NHS complaints advocacy and how that overlaps with every type of, or the other types of statutory advocacy. And this one's quite simple because I think NHS complaints advocacy overlaps with everything. And the reason for that is if you are eligible for Care Act advocacy, if you're eligible for IMHA, if you're eligible for a children's advocate, you may wish to make a complaint about any NHS services that you're receiving or trying to access. So you may want to think, if you're an IMHA, for instance, is it more helpful for you to support the person through the complaint, or is it better for an NHS complaint advocate to come in? And it's almost like you want to have that conversation with your partner to work out, what would they prefer? Would they prefer somebody that they know, or would they prefer somebody with a lot of technical expertise around the complaint process? And I guess that's going to depend on the person's needs and what the issues that they're complaining with. If it's particularly complicated or complex, you might want to get a specialist person in, but don't, underestimate the value of having rapport with somebody, and they might want you to help them much more than a new advocate coming in. But it's about, isn't it, giving that person choice and helping them to make that decision. The other crossover that we can briefly touch upon is that of children's advocacy with Care Act advocacy. And for a lot of young people, as they go through the transition process, and remember, when we talk about transition, we're talking about moving from children's services to adult services. So really this is kicking in around the age of 15, 16, and it's going to go until they move into adult services. Now, if you're a care leaver or you've been receiving support from the local authority to your child, a disabled child, if you're going to have, or it's likely that you'll have needs as an adult, so adult social care needs, then you can ask for an assessment to be done under the Care Act. And again, I think it makes sense, if you're the children's advocate, to talk to the young person about, would they rather you support them through that process as the children's advocate, or would they rather have that specialist, with the technical experience and understands what the Care Act requires? Now, the children's advocate, I think it makes sense if they're Care Act trained, because then they can do both and really help that young person avoid multiple, adults coming into their life to dip in and out. The last crossover is between the deprivation of liberty safeguards. And of course, all adults receiving care, from the age of 16 and up, will be impacted by DOLS. So if you're working with people who have got adult social care needs, you need to be thinking, do any of the restrictions or do any of the methods in the care plan, do any of the way the care is delivered, does any of these decisions, do they amount to a potential restriction and or deprivation of that person's liberty? And if they do, then you need to be asking for that to be properly authorised through the correct process. So you can have lots of Care Act advocates, of course, supporting people who are living in arranged accommodation or having care plans that restrict, or they're under loss of supervision, or there's limits on what they can and can't do. So for a Care Act advocate, it's really important that you're thinking about DOLS, and if that needs to be authorised, and asking questions of the local authority just to make sure. Similarly, if you're a DOLS IMCA, then you need to be thinking about who's supporting the person through the broader care and support planning. So if you're an IMCA instructed for the deprivation of liberty, I would be looking at the person's care plan, of course, but then asking, is there a Care Act advocate around to support them with that? And again, what's coming, the two different advocates, it's totally appropriate for them to be the same person. So the IMCA and the Care Act advocate can be the same person, and it makes sense. So that's the kind of final thought. Talk to your partner if they're entitled to more than one type of advocacy, and just ask those questions to make sure the local authority. I would issue a little plea that you don't get too annoyed with local authorities and NHS bodies that don't understand advocacy. There's 6 types of statutory advocacy. They're not going to know the difference between an IMHA and an IMCA. Just accept it, that they're not going to know the difference. So make it easy. Make it easy for them to instruct the right advocate. You be that person reminding and informing decision makers when different advocacy, and make it seamless. You know, just accept that referral, get on with it, and make sure the person, because the point, isn't it, is to make sure the person's supported through these important decisions.